Summer 1971. Two US congressmen land in Saigon on an official inspection tour. Within days of arriving, Robert Steele of Connecticut and Morgan Murphy of Illinois have their answer. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of the American soldiers fighting in Vietnam, young men from Ohio, Texas, Georgia, California, are addicted to heroin. Not experimenting with it, addicted. The drug is available on base for $6 a bag, and it is nearly 90% pure. For comparison, a street bag in New York City at the same time cost more and tested under 10% purity. Someone was flooding the war zone with the cheapest, most potent heroin on earth. Steele and Murphy fly home and go straight to the White House. Nixon goes in front of a microphone on June 17, 1971, and declares drug abuse public enemy number one. He creates a new federal office. He talks about fighting a war on drugs. What he does not tell the American public is what the CIA already knows. What nobody says out loud is where the heroin is coming from, who is producing it, and what decisions made by the US government in the mountains of Southeast Asia had already made this epidemic not just possible, but practically guaranteed. The answer begins in a place most Americans have never heard of. A mountainous jungle region the size of Montana, where three countries meet at the edge of the Mekong River. A place that, for most of the 20th century, produced more opium than anywhere else on Earth. A place that the US government helped build into the world's largest drug supply chain, in the name of fighting communism. This is the story of the Golden Triangle. Before anyone called it the Golden Triangle, before the CIA knew it existed, before the first gram of heroin ever crossed a border, there was just a landscape, and it was extraordinary. Find where the borders of Burma, Laos, and Thailand meet near the Mekong River. The terrain becomes almost impassable, ridgelines stacked behind ridgelines, valleys so deep they hold their own weather systems, villages connected to the outside world by footpaths that became rivers of mud for months at a time. The altitude, consistently above 6,000 feet, creates a climate unlike anything in the surrounding lowlands. Cool and misty in summer, dry enough in winter for specific crops that cannot grow anywhere else in the region. The mountains are taller than anything in the continental United States east of the Rockies. The people who lived here, the Hmong, the Yao, the Lahu, the Akha, the Lisu, had been pressed into these mountains over centuries by the expanding Han Chinese populations to the north. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, clearing forest, planting for 2 or 3 years until the soil gave out, then moving on. And they had, by the late 19th century, begun cultivating a crop that outsiders had introduced and that suited these mountains almost perfectly: the opium poppy. The plant itself is ancient. The Sumerians were cultivating Papaver somniferum in Lower Mesopotamia as far back as 3400 BC, calling it the joy plant. It spread through the ancient world along trade routes: Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia, India, used as medicine, as ritual, as the closest thing the ancient world had to a painkiller. Arab traders carried it east. The peoples of these mountains were cultivating opium long before the United States existed. Centuries before the framers put quill to parchment in Philadelphia. Stand on a hillside in Burma's Shan State in November, when the rains have stopped and the cold settles in. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. The poppy plants are knee-high, their grey-green leaves catching thin winter light. Come December, the flower petals drop, and what remains is a green seed pod about the size of a hen's egg. That is where the opium lives, a milky white latex that oozes when the pod is scored with a curved blade. It dries overnight into sticky brown gum. That brown gum, collected by hand from thousands of plants across hundreds of hillside fields, is raw opium. Refined into morphine, it becomes medicine. Refined further into heroin, it becomes something else entirely. The hill tribes of northern Thailand, Burma, and Laos had been growing opium commercially since the late 19th century, when the colonial powers, the French in Indochina, the British in Burma, not only permitted it, but actively encouraged it. Opium was taxable. The French colonial government in Indochina ran an official opium monopoly that funded a significant share of colonial administration. When World War II interrupted sea trade routes supplying the colonies with processed opium from India, the French response was simple: encourage Hmong farmers in Laos to grow more. The supply had been interrupted, the demand had not. By the time the war ended, the mountains of the Golden Triangle were already a significant opium-producing zone. The area produced perhaps 80 tons of raw opium per year, a substantial amount, but still regional in scale. What was about to happen would change that number by an order of magnitude. In 1949, the Communist Revolution in China succeeded. Mao Zedong's forces swept through Yunnan province, and tens of thousands of soldiers from the defeated nationalist Chinese army, the Kuomintang, the KMT, retreated across the border into Burma's Shan states. Hungry, armed, without a country. The communists simultaneously did something nobody in the West expected. They aggressively eradicated opium production inside China. Within a few years, the ancient opium trade of Yunnan had virtually ceased. The global opium supply had a gap. The mountains of Burma, Thailand, and Laos were about to fill it. Something enormous was about to happen, and Washington was going to help make it possible. The KMT soldiers who crossed into Burma in 1949 and 1950 were not just refugees. In the eyes of the CIA and the Truman administration, they were an asset. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese leader who had fled to Taiwan, insisted he would retake the Chinese mainland. Washington, newly terrified by the communist seizure of China and the outbreak of the Korean War, was looking for any lever it could find in Southeast Asia. Here were battle-hardened nationalist troops sitting in the mountains of Burma. Here was the opportunity. In February 1951, the CIA launched Operation Paper. American planes, operated by Civil Air Transport, a CIA airline that would later become the more famous Air America, began shuttling arms, supplies, and advisors to KMT General Lee Mee's forces at their base at Mong Sat in Burma's Shan states. The airstrip at Mong Sat was constructed by CIA engineers. The operation was funded with American taxpayer money. The goal was to arm and supply a KMT army capable of invading Yunnan province in southern China, and in theory, distracting or destabilizing Mao's new government. The invasions failed, miserably. The first KMT incursion into Yunnan in April 1951 was repelled within days. CIA advisors were killed. The KMT retreated back to Burma. They tried again, failed again. They tried a third time, failed again. The dream of retaking China was dead, and everyone involved knew it. But the army in the mountains didn't go away, and an army needs money. People were cultivating opium in these mountains long before the CIA arrived. The KMT didn't invent the trade. What they did was industrialize it. They taxed the hill tribe farmers who grew opium. They built processing facilities. They organized mule caravans that moved raw opium out of the mountains and down to Bangkok and Saigon for distribution. By 1960, annual opium production in the Golden Triangle had grown from roughly 80 tons to somewhere between 300 and 400 tons. By 1970, estimates put it at over 700 tons. The mountain region where three countries met had become the single largest source of opium on Earth. And the CIA, according to historian Alfred McCoy's exhaustively documented research, was not merely watching this happen. CAT and Air America pilots, flying routes authorized and funded by the US government, carried raw opium out of the KMT-controlled mountain villages. General Owan Ratikone, the commander of the Royal Lao Army and a close American partner in the anti-communist effort, operated what McCoy described as the world's largest heroin laboratory. When McCoy visited Laos in 1971 to research what would become his landmark book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, General Owan opened his opium ledgers for inspection. No effort was made to hide it. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shaped the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between? I always want to know. By the late 1950s, the KMT forces in Burma's Shan states controlled something that no amount of military failure could have produced: a drug empire. KMT Colonel Tuan Shiwen, commanding the Fifth Army, explained the logic to a British journalist in 1967 in terms that were utterly candid. "We have to continue to fight the evil of communism," he said. "And to fight you must have an army, and an army must have guns, and to buy guns you must have money. In these mountains, the only money is opium." By 1973, according to Alfred McCoy, KMT forces controlled an estimated 90% of the opium coming out of Burma and roughly 1/3 of the total global illegal opium supply. 1/3 of the world's illegal opium, controlled by an army the CIA had helped arm and sustain. The Golden Triangle was not a single operation run by a single cartel. It was a system. At the base of it were the hill tribe farmers, Hmong, Yao, Lahu, Akha, working their mountain fields, growing poppies alongside corn and dry rice. A full season's harvest from a single family's field might produce 10 or 15 pounds of raw opium gum. That was their cash income for the year. That was how they paid for the silver jewelry that marked wealth and status. That was how they survived. Above them in the hierarchy were the buyers, KMT officers and their proxies, who moved through the villages after harvest, paying for the raw opium and loading it onto mule caravans. The caravans could stretch for miles through mountain jungle, armed guards, hundreds of mules, routes that wound through territory where no government had reliable authority. The raw opium traveled south, to processing facilities in northern Thailand and across the border, where chemists converted it into morphine base, then into the white powder that could travel far more efficiently. At the bottom of the mountain, the value of the product had multiplied. A pound of raw opium worth a few dollars in the village became, after processing and transit, a product worth hundreds of times that in Bangkok or Saigon. And beyond Bangkok and Saigon, on the streets of American cities, the multiplier was staggering. The same quantity of heroin that cost $1 to produce in Burma was worth thousands of dollars by the time it reached New York. Tiny Laos, a country smaller than Wyoming, was producing opium that moved through networks spanning 10,000 miles to reach American cities. The trade route from the Mekong River highlands to the streets of Harlem was, in every meaningful sense, longer than driving from New York City to Los Angeles and back, twice. This decision, to arm and supply anti-communist proxies in the drug-producing mountains of Southeast Asia, and to look the other way as those proxies paid for everything with opium, seemed strategic at the time. It was not. The people at the bottom of this machine were the hill tribe farmers, and their story almost never gets told. Picture a Hmong village on a Burma mountainside in the mid-1960s. The village might hold 200 or 300 people. They live in wooden longhouses, cook over open fires, keep pigs and chickens. They have no electricity, no road, no clinic within a day's walk. They have been growing opium poppies since before their grandparents' time, because the colonial powers told them to, because there was nothing else that could be sold for cash, because the traders who came from the lowlands wanted nothing they had except this one crop. After the KMT arrived, the farmers had new masters. The KMT taxed the opium heavily enough that farmers had to increase production just to break even. Those who failed to comply faced coercion and, in some cases, violence. A missionary working with the Lahu people in Burma's Kengtung state testified that KMT forces tortured local farmers who refused to cooperate. This was not a market, it was extraction. The poppy harvest runs December through February. Farmers work before dawn in the cold, scoring each pod with a curved blade, then returning the next morning to scrape off dried brown latex. A farmer might score 1,000 plants a day, hands permanently stained, knees worn from hillside terrain, at angles that would make an Iowa cornfield look flat. Children worked beside their parents from the time they were old enough to hold a blade. Opium addiction spread through the same villages that grew it. Farmers smoked it for pain, for cold, for the weight of a life with no safety net. In some Hmong communities in Laos, The addiction rate quietly devastated working-age populations across entire villages. Quick question. How many pounds of heroin do you think the average American city neighborhood was consuming per week at the height of this trade in the early 1970s? Drop your guess in the comments. The answer is going to reframe everything you think you know about who built what. Meanwhile, 12,000 miles away, the product from those hillside fields was beginning to arrive in the United States in quantities nobody had seen before. The Golden Triangle had been a regional opium producer. It was becoming something else, and the instrument of that transformation was a war America was already losing. No event did more to scale up the Golden Triangle's American reach than the Vietnam War. By the late 1960s, the United States had stationed several million servicemen in Southeast Asia. The war had no clear front, no clear objective, and no visible end. Drugs were everywhere: marijuana, amphetamines, and, most significantly, heroin. The heroin was from the Golden Triangle. A $6 bag in Saigon was nearly 90% pure. A street bag in New York at the same time cost more and tested at barely 10%. American soldiers were being offered heroin 20 times purer than what was available at home, at a fraction of the price. The result was predictable. By the summer of 1971, when Congressmen Steele and Murphy landed in Saigon, the crisis had been building for years. Follow-up research by the White House's own Special Action Office confirmed the scope of it. Up to 34% of American troops in Vietnam had used heroin during their deployment. One survey of the 101st Airborne Division, the same unit that had fought at Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge, found that between 40 and 50% of the men had either experimented with or become addicted to hard drugs, primarily heroin. Military doctors estimated that as many as 20% of troops were addicted outright. The US government knew. Congress was briefed. Nixon declared a crisis. What he did not say, and what the CIA was not going to volunteer, was that the heroin-flooding American military bases in Vietnam was moving through supply chains that American policy had helped build. Air America, the CIA airline, had been operating in the region for over a decade. The corridors that moved opium out of Burma and Laos to processing facilities, and then to Saigon, were the same corridors that American intelligence was using to supply anti-communist proxy forces. The two operations were not separate. They ran through the same planes, the same routes, the same network of warlords and generals who were simultaneously on the CIA payroll and in the heroin business. McCoy documented this in 1972. The CIA tried to suppress the book before publication. A CIA agent physically threatened McCoy's research team in the Laotian highlands. The effort failed. The book was published. It was largely ignored. The pipeline kept running. And when the last American helicopters lifted off the embassy roof in Saigon in April 1975, the pipeline did not close. The addicted veterans came home. The heroin followed. What I haven't told you yet is what happened to American cities after 1975, and who kept the machine running. There is a through line in this story that spans decades, implicates decisions made by both Democratic and Republican administrations, and runs directly from a mountain village in Burma to the streets of Baltimore, Detroit, and the South Bronx. Start in 1951. The CIA launches Operation Paper. They arm KMT forces in Burma's Shan states. The KMT pays for everything with opium. The CIA knows. The decision to look away, or to actively facilitate, was made in Washington, with full knowledge that these forces were financing themselves through the drug trade. This is not speculation. The documentation comes, in part, from the CIA's own reading room. A declassified CIA document describing the period notes explicitly that the operations theater was also a major opium-growing region. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the predecessor to the DEA, was, at this time, run by Harry Anslinger, a man who had spent his career declaring war on drugs and drug traffickers. During the years of Operation Paper, the FBN recorded only a single seizure of Thai drugs for over a decade. One seizure from 2 sailors, in a region that was producing hundreds of tons of opium per year. The protection that the CIA's alliance with KMT drug lords provided extended, in practice, to the FBN's operational priorities. While Anslinger publicly blamed the Chinese communists for flooding the world with drugs, his agency was leaving the actual traffickers, who were on the CIA payroll, entirely alone. This is the part that should make you angry, not because it happened, but because it kept happening for decades. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the pattern repeated. In Laos, the CIA ran Operation Momentum, a massive covert effort to arm Hmong fighters under General Vang Pao against the communist Pathet Lao. Vang Pao was a brilliant guerrilla commander. He was also, according to multiple documented sources, including McCoy's direct interviews, operating within a network that used Air America flights to move opium out of Hmong-controlled mountains. Air America helicopters, American aircraft, American pilots, a CIA airline, carried raw opium from Hmong villages to Vang Pao's headquarters at Long Tieng. When McCoy confronted this in his research, CIA Director Richard Helms arranged for the agency to review the manuscript and demand changes. A federal court ruled against suppression. The book was published in 1972. McCoy's research team had been shot at in the Laotian highlands by members of the CIA's secret army. The US government did not want this story told. Congress received hearings, reports documented the problem. Connections between American allies in Southeast Asia and the drug trade hitting American cities were established in the public record. Nothing happened. The alliances were too valuable. The Cold War logic was too powerful. The heroin was a side effect, and the people dying from it were, to the decision-makers in Washington, acceptable losses. That phrase deserves to sit there for a moment. The heroin that moved through the Golden Triangle pipeline in the 1970s hit American cities at a specific moment of maximum vulnerability. The Vietnam veterans were coming home. The inner cities of Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, and New York were experiencing deindustrialization, factories closing, jobs vanishing, entire neighborhoods destabilizing. Into this landscape, a flood of cheap, high-purity heroin arrived. In New York City alone, estimates suggested roughly 200,000 heroin addicts by the early 1970s, more people than currently live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Harlem, the South Bronx, Bedford-Stuyvesant, neighborhoods that had been, a generation earlier, working-class communities with functioning economies became defined, in the public imagination, entirely by this epidemic. The crime that followed, the deaths, the families destroyed, the property abandoned. The cost to American cities in lost tax revenue, emergency medical care, law enforcement, and social services ran into billions, in an era when cities were already going bankrupt. The heroin that did this damage was, according to the DEA's own documentation, sourced primarily from the Golden Triangle through the 1970s and early 1980s. At the peak of the Golden Triangle's dominance, Burma alone accounted for an estimated 80% of the heroin reaching the east coast of the United States. New York City's supply, per US Senate testimony cited in multiple academic studies, was at one point 80% sourced from Golden Triangle production. Meanwhile, back in the mountains, the warlord who had come to dominate this trade was a man named Kun Sa, born Jiang Chifu to a Chinese father and Shan mother in Burma's Shan state. Kun Sa had built a private army by the 1980s that at its peak numbered roughly 20,000 men. He controlled, by US government estimates, somewhere between half and 70% of the heroin coming out of the Golden Triangle. In 1977, he made the United States government a formal offer: buy his entire opium supply. He put it in writing. He would sell them all of it for a negotiated price, and he would stop producing. The US declined. No administration wanted the political optics of buying drugs from a warlord, even to take them off the market. In January 1990, a federal grand jury in Brooklyn, New York, indicted Kun Sa on heroin trafficking charges. The specific charge, importing 1,600 kilograms of heroin into New York City over 18 months. That is about 3,500 pounds of heroin, delivered to American neighborhoods. The US State Department's ambassador to Thailand called him the worst enemy the world has. His own lawyer might have observed that he had, for much of his career, enjoyed the indirect protection of American geopolitical priorities. Khun Sa surrendered to the Burmese military government in 1996. In exchange, he received a mansion in Yangon and a guarantee that Burma would not extradite him to the United States. He died there in 2007, in comfort, never facing an American court. The DEA had spent over 2 decades trying to capture or kill him. The CIA's network of alliances in the 1950s had helped make him possible. The opioid crisis that America is living through right now, fentanyl, prescription pills, the 80,000 plus overdose deaths per year in recent years, is not directly the Golden Triangle's work. The current crisis has its own architecture, its own corporate villains, its own FDA failures, and Purdue Pharma boardrooms. But the population of Americans primed for opioid addiction by the heroin epidemic of the 1970s and 1980s, the infrastructure of distribution built during those decades, the cultural normalization of opioid abuse in specific American communities, all of that has a history. And part of that history begins in a mountain village in Burma in 1950, with a CIA airstrip and a Cold War logic that said the ends justified the means. The economic cost of the modern American opioid epidemic, including heroin, prescription opioids, and synthetic opioids, was estimated by the CDC at over $1 trillion in 2017 alone. $1 trillion in a single year. The Congressional Joint Economic Committee estimated the crisis cost the United States nearly $1.5 trillion in 2020. They knew what they were building in those mountains. Some of them, anyway. And they kept building. The Golden Triangle's dominance ended gradually. Thai authorities, under American pressure, began crop substitution programs in the 1980s and 1990s, paying hill tribe farmers to grow coffee, cabbage, strawberries, anything but poppies. The Thai section largely cleaned up by the early 1990s. Khun Sa's surrender in 1996 fragmented the Burmese networks. By the early 21st century, Afghanistan had overtaken Burma as the world's largest opium producer. But the triangle didn't vanish. It pivoted. The same mountain region, the same border zones, the same networks of corrupt officials and ethnic militias that had run opium for 50 years shifted to methamphetamine. Meth seizures in East and Southeast Asia hit a record 236 tons in 2024, a 24% jump from the year before. The infrastructure of lawlessness the Cold War helped build in those mountains was never fully dismantled. It just changed its product. For Americans, the legacy is more intimate than a headline. The opioid crisis that killed over 80,000 Americans in 2022, more than died in the entire Vietnam War, was not caused by the Golden Triangle, but it grew in soil the Golden Triangle helped prepare. The communities hollowed out by the 1970s heroin epidemic, the veterans who came home addicted, the distribution networks built in American cities during those decades, the cultural familiarity with opioid abuse that made the pivot to prescription pills in the 1990s so seamless. More than 2 million Americans currently meet diagnostic criteria for opioid use disorder, more than the entire population of New Mexico. The cumulative overdose death toll since 1999 has surpassed 1 million Americans. More than US military deaths in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. The heroin that fed American cities in the 1970s came from Burma. The policy protecting the networks producing it was made in Washington. The people who died were in Detroit, Baltimore, the South Bronx, and hundreds of smaller American cities that no foreign policy document ever mentioned by name. You will not find the Golden Triangle at your local CVS. You will not find it at Walmart or Costco or in your pantry. It does not live there anymore, not directly. What it left behind is subtler and more durable. Slow down here for a second, because this is the part that the rest of the story has been building toward. In 1951, a decision was made in Washington. Arm these anti-communist forces in Burma. Look the other way on how they fund themselves. prioritized the Cold War over the consequences of a different war being waged on American streets. It was made by people in suits, in offices, with classified cables and plausible deniability. And then it was made again, in different forms, by different administrations, through the 1960s and into the 1970s. The American soldiers who came home from Vietnam addicted did not make that decision. The families in Harlem who lost fathers and sons to the 1970s epidemic did not vote on Operation Paper. The farmers in the Shan states who grew poppies because an occupying army allowed them nothing else did not choose this. The chain from decision to consequence is unusually direct. The CIA built the airstrip. The airstrip moved the opium. The opium became heroin. The heroin went to Saigon. The soldiers brought the habit home. The epidemic followed. How many things in your life right now exist because someone in a government office made a calculation you were never told about? Let that sit. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the things that run your life, subscribe. Hit the like button if you want to keep going deeper. Share this with someone who thinks they already know what the Cold War was about. The next time you see a headline about the opioid crisis, the deaths, the costs, the communities destroyed, you'll know the roots go further back than a Purdue Pharma boardroom, further back than a congressional hearing, all the way to a mountainside in Burma where an American airstrip was built with taxpayer money, and a CIA pilot looked the other way at what was loaded on the return flight. They built the pipeline, we paid for it in lives, and we're still counting.